Uh, some of you, some of you are also from well beyond the Harvard community, and I want to extend a very special welcome to you all. This is a series of speakers events that has been organized by four folks who I want to identify before we go any further. Lucia Lee Laughlin, Ashley Whitfield, Caitlin Pomerantz, and Garrett O'Bricky. Garrett welcomed us. All students in the Arts and Education program who have taken it on themselves to take the leadership in organizing this speaker series. And they've done this with great energy, grace, and care. And so I thank them and am excited to enter into this second conversation as part of this series. So the series is designed to explore work at the intersection of art, education, and social justice. And our speakers today, each in their own way, works at that intersection. Sometimes they actually work with each other, and we may hear about that a little bit, but often they work in many different and varied contexts. Each of them comes at their work balancing the elements of art, learning, education, and activism in different ways and distinctive ways, and they bring other elements into their work as well. So I want to just quickly introduce them rather than giving long biographical backgrounds on each of them. I thought it would make sense in the precious little time that we have together to say just a tiny bit about them and their current work, and then to hand it to them so that they can share with you in much more detail what they're up to at this intersection of art and education and social justice. So first, the first guest that we will hear from today is Kimathi Donkor. Kimathi is an artist. He is the painting course leader at Camberwell College of Arts in London. Then we'll hear from Raimi Gbadamosi, and Raimi is an artist and writer and the head of fine arts at De Montfort University in Leicester. And then finally, we'll hear from Mark Miller. Mark is head of program and practice in the learning and research area at the Tate Museums in London. We will hear from each of these guests for about 10 minutes, get some orientation to how they, to some of the work that they do at this intersection, and then we'll come together and open it up. I will share a question or so, but we very much want to make sure that we have some time as well for questions from you all, which you can put into the chat along the way or at the end when we get there. And with that, I would like to turn to Kimathi to share a little bit about the work that he's currently doing. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you. Hi there. Thank you very much, Steve, for that introduction. So, hi everybody. I'm speaking to you, as you can see, from sunny Cornwall in the southwest of England. It's a very nice day today. I want to share with you some ideas about my art practice, my education practice, and how that kind of intersects also with what we call social justice or activism. So we don't have very long, and I've got a few slides I'm going to show you. So I'm going to just disappear from the screen, which is bad news, but I'm going to do it and just share with you this wonderful PowerPoint presentation, which I've created especially for this moment. So let me just share the screen and share. So can you all see that? Yep, good. Okay, so teaching Black art in thought and practice is what I want to kind of talk about. just to give a sort of idea of some of the teaching I've been doing at the University of the Arts London over the past few years. And let's get this straight. First, I want to just show you this couple of slides about my own painting practice. So I'm a painter, kind of, I suppose I work in the field of what I call history painting. And you might also describe it as black art if you were so inclined. So a series of paintings I created quite a long time ago about the Haitian Revolution. Some of those paintings, there was an installation view of some of that painting in the Venice Biennale, painting about some police violence in the UK, an installation shot, another installation shot from the International Slavery Museum, one of my assemblages being installed, and some more recent works, some drawing. I've been doing a series of drawings, and my sort of more recent painting in which I'm exploring the idea of idylls and I suppose leisure. So back in sort of about 2012, so almost 10 years ago, I started working at the University of the Arts London, and I was curating a show, and I wanted to speak to the faculty about some of the background for this show, which was supposed to be a show celebrating Black alumni of the university. And so to create this sort of, I suppose, a momentum for this particular event, I was creating these information slides, these info slides about ethnicity, race, and art practice and education in London. So this one, for example, talks about our student ethnicity data. The University of the Arts London has about 37% of its students who are people of color, 63% white, which roughly corresponds with the percentage of in London. People in America might be surprised to know that London is about 65% white city. It's, in other words, there's a lot of people of color, Black people, Asian people, African people living here. But then if you look at the staff background of our university, it's a very big difference. And we also had quite a big, what they call attainment gap between white and Black students, which is, I don't know if my mouse works. Can you see my pointer? Yeah, so this is the attainment gap. 73% of white students getting a first, only 51% of Black students. Ethnic background, that's London's ethnic makeup, university's ethnic makeup. So just some interesting notes. And also wanted to explore with them the way that art history and art is taught in the university setting. And I gave an example for one of the sort of an important resource, which would be the World History of Art by Honor and Fleming. African artists, 5% of the total. European artists, 77% of the total of this world history of art, mind you. Europe has got less people than Africa, but somehow ends up with 3/4 of the art history in this world history of art. So it's just kind of an example of the way that art is taught, really, and because obviously art is often taught by exemplar, you know, who's been making what, where, when, and how. So next up in this whistle-top tour of my practice, I'm going to be looking at some of the ways which I've tried to sort of intervene in that kind of curriculum directly. So in 2016, so working with Professor Sonia Boyce, who's a very prominent artist in the UK, I set up at Chelsea College of Arts this thing called a Black Art Practice, which is a 4-day workshop in which I invited artists like Ajamu, Parminder Kaur, and Mary Evans to come and sort of do some practice-based workshops with students. It wasn't restricted to students of color, but you know, it's whoever wanted to come. And this is kind of one of the outcomes. So Ajamu, who's a photographer, he was getting the students to work with Polaroids. And then we had a little bit of mini show as well. And this is a group photo of me and some of the students who were taking part, or I think most of the students who were taking part in the workshop at Chelsea. And then they spontaneously then went on to produce their own kind of show, which, and when they produced a little publication called The Beginnings of Truth. And in that publication, they sort of included some quotes about what they thought about this Black Art Practice Workshop, what it meant for them. So this is the quote here: "The Black Art Practice Workshop helped me to think more critically about what it means to be an artist of color working in the UK right now, highlighted a wealth of artists who challenge the political framework they operate within." And by the way, that kind of show was kind of spontaneous. I didn't ask them to do it or to make this publication, but they felt so strongly about the impact of working with these artists in this sort of way that they wanted to sort of make their own statement about how important it had been to them. And I went on to sort of develop this, this sort of way of working further throughout other colleges in the university. So our university, University of the Arts London, is like a kind of conglomerate of about 6 sort of art colleges. And so in, again in 2016 at Wimbledon College of Arts, I became a senior lecturer. I sort of applied for a job and got it, and working with what we call contextual studies. So this is teaching, you know, the context of art. And this time, unlike the previous thing which I showed you, which was sort of more of a extracurricular, I took the opportunity to embed this way of working in the sort of formal curricula. So these are lectures which are part of the students' assessed, you know, attendance. They get assessed in their degree about the notes and stuff which they take from these lectures. So you can see that from the first series, I sort of invited the same people, Paminda Ajamu, Mary Evans, and John Lyons from the Chelsea to come and speak at Wimbledon in these lectures, which weren't really, these aren't any more practice kind of based workshops. They're just straight up, you know, hour-long lectures. And then we did it again in the following semester with another series of lectures, including Professor Lubena Hemid, who was an alumni of Wimbledon. She'd never been invited to speak there before, despite being one of the UK's most prominent artists. She won the Turner Prize that year, which is the UK's thing. And so it was very, very lucky that we managed to get her to come and speak before she then became, you know, a global megastar. And then I sort of took it further, the whole thing into Central St. Martin's. I started working at Central St. Martin's as well, and created another series of sort of lectures, seminars, this time again for part of an assessed module that they called Unit 6 on their fine art undergraduate degree. And this time it was called Black Thought in Art, or Black Thought in the Politics of Art. Was the initial title, though I changed it. I sort of shortened it the next year to Black Thought in Art. And this was a much more theoretical type of sort of discourse, where it wasn't I didn't have guest lecturers. It was me just giving a discourse about Black thought in the art world. So thinking about figures like Stuart Hall, people like Lubena Hemid, Yinka Shonabari, Okwe Nwezu, just figures from sort of around the world, themed in different sort of lectures over the period of a semester, as a sort of way of, I suppose, bringing together a whole panoply of ideas. And just here I did a sort of little, you know, survey about how students thought about this, you know, what they'd experienced. And one of the questions, what effect have the seminars had on your art? And a student, it's an anonymous survey, an immense effect. It offered me the background knowledge and references in education I had always been craving, that I wasn't being given anywhere else through the college. They inspired me to bring other students to discuss things which we had learned, gave me access to other artists and research that I wanted. So in other words, kind of fulfilling a really powerful need and sense of lack in the curriculum around questions of race and identity in the teaching of art. And that, I think, brings me back to the first slide. And I think we're at the end. So 10 minutes, exactly. It's going to go off in 5 seconds. You'll hear it. It's going to go off. 3, 2, 1. There you go. 10 minutes. How's that?
Beautiful,
Got
Kimathi.
sharing.
Perfect. Kimathi, there's so much in what you just shared that is so deeply at the intersection of politics, social justice, teaching, learning, and the arts, and much to open up. But let's go right now and spend some time with Raimi. So, Raimi, why don't you take over?
Hello. Let's see. Okay. I'm going to do this in, excuse me. I'm going to have to do this in two parts. I'm very deliberately going to take you through a number of pieces of my work that hopefully would tell its own story. The first piece I would like to talk about is a piece called Shrine, which was installed at the Market Gallery in Glasgow. Now, Shrine was an exhibition event, well, elongated event about Fela Anikulapo Kuti. Now, Fela Anikulapo Kuti was a Nigerian musician who was deeply political. He kind of effectively altered the way that most people thought about themselves, the nation state, and I guess people at large. So for the installation, what you saw a moment ago, there were two galleries. One was completely sealed, the way that power structures itself, that where you see it from the outside. The other gallery was completely open. And in this instance, there was a dance floor, there was free food and drink for the duration of the show. And there were three games that you could play: Go, chess, or backgammon, or all three Manichaean. During the exhibition, we had discussions, open discussions. Local politicians were invited to come in to speak about the nature of politics and power and how it affects individuals. Now, over time, it became so normalized that a lot of people thought that this was the permanent setup for the gallery, because anyone could walk in from the street and eat food and play games and talk politics. That was a simple rule. The only thing you could do was discuss politics. So the clear intention in this instance was, in fact, to engage, to make kind of politics the center of a discussion. I mean, for me, this is really important. My practice revolves around the question of race, language, and power. And the choice of games was not accidental. Kind of the way that games function, they're equally combative and collegial simultaneously. And so it allowed a particular understanding to occur within a gallery. I mean, the gallery, after a while, the idea that the gallery blends into something that it is not, that it is not necessarily the place you come to see, but you come to do, you come to learn, you come to engage. So I am just going to let you see my face for a while I take you, go back to another part. Oops. I don't know what you can see at the moment. Can you just see me?
You can.
Okay, great. Because I need to do some technical magic here. And move along. Great. So I'm going to come back to you and share my screen again. Okay. Again, I would like to kind of return to the gallery. And I suppose when I was thinking about this evening, I did consider what it's, kind of those two moments. Does the artwork do the work? Or is it me as an individual that does the work in relationship to engaging an audience, students, with kind of the issues of politics, and in my instance of politics of race. So anyway, back to the gallery. As I said, I want to try and use the gallery deliberately. This is a piece called Limitations. And for this, I tried to figure out what to be the minimum amount of kit that one would need to put in an exhibition. An awful lot of paint, as you can see, dividing the gallery deliberately into sections, kind of obsessively. There are 729 lines in the gallery, which go through a series of permutations. There are 3 non-identical flags, and there are 3 of my heads. Now, again, kind of dealing with issues of kind of culture, the head being really significant within Yoruba culture, and the idea that there are 3 heads. And so for me, the 3 heads were important, but also the way that the head functions within kind of Western iconography in relationship to power, the role of the bust. So that's the 3rd head. For this, I gave 2 discursive pieces, both of them relying on Machiavelli. So I gave one talk about the prince, and the second talk was about the discourses. Now, it's worth mentioning, kind of going into those texts for a moment, because most people know the prince, which ironically is a text that was written for a princess, by the way. It's worth pointing out, it was actually written for a princess, about how to rule and how to control people. And those of you who know the text, you'll know that it's quite a short book. Machiavelli wrote a much longer book called The Discourses, a very long book indeed, which was how the individual person makes sure that they do not lose power. And he takes everyone through the history of power and its construction. Very quickly, this is again meeting with the public, and these are a series of non-British flags. And the non is very deliberate here, that they are British flags, but how does the individual identify themselves within Britain when kind of Britain has been overly racialized? And for those of you who've followed British news recently, there was an exchange with David Lammy, one of our members of parliament, where he was being asked publicly on the radio, was effectively being told that he could never be English, and by extension, never be British, even though he's a member of government. An exhibition in the south of Britain to commemorate in 2008, the end of the sale in slaves. Now, it is worth pointing out, this is not the end of the slave trade, but when Britain decided to declare that it would no longer take part, which was a bit of a misnomer, but that's for another moment. Okay, again, the use of space and power. So this is a piece in Belfast Exposed, where I created a mechanism for individuals to come in and use the gallery for whatever they wanted to. But and kind of the role again of power within the gallery. How does the gallery function? How do we engage with it? I'm going to kind of whip through, because I'm trying to beat Kimathi's 10 minutes here. And sort of, this is just an installation shot of a larger piece on the outside called The Republic Faces the Sun. And the 3 colors, might come to this, really kind of black, white, and yellow, are effectively a narrative around kind of racial divisions and how language is constructed. This is kind of where I would like to end, which is a piece called Cemetery. Now, Kimathi a moment ago was speaking about who is allowed in, kind of within power structures. And for this, I created a personal archive. So all of the names you see on the wall, everyone who's on the wall has to be dead. So let's just be clear about this. But these are the people who have had a profound impact on me. And in them entering into the cemetery, it had to be recalled from memory. Now, kind of how we as individuals construct our narratives is profoundly personal. But over time, when we kind of congregate everything, it becomes incredibly political. And I'll end with this shot, which is 3 tombstones for me, in that they all have my name and birth date, but not my death date, because obviously I'm still around. So I think I'll end with that, and we can deal with more later. Thank you very much.
Raimi, thank you. This is wonderfully provocative, and again, I'll hold thought and comment, and we'll turn to Mark, and then we'll come back. But thank you, Mark.
Yeah,
Welcome,
thanks,
Mark.
Gareth. So yeah, my talk is kind of slightly institutional, my role at Tate, and what I've been asking myself, and I thought I'd bring this question to the table, which is, what if we just paused? I think this is about the current moment, and what do we think about the work that we produce, especially at Tate? How can we stop, reflect, reset, rewind, fast forward, etc.? Next slide, please, Gareth. So yeah, I just wanted to say a little bit about, I suppose, how I arrived at Tate, which was completely accidental. My background is really youth work, social justice, and the problematics of formal education. And those things began through music, actually. I used to work with young people through my youth work capacity to basically inform young people who had been excluded from schools back into education. And one of the techniques was through music, teaching beats, etc., how to kind of re-engage in literacy, basic literacy, numeracy. And I've put this line here, young, gifted, and Black British, quite interesting that I think both Raimi and Kimathi mentioned the context of the UK, and I think it's really important, and the connection to class and access. And I think as a young Black man growing up in London, in South London specifically, there are many experiences that hold with me, that stay with me, and that continue to stay with me, and has influenced the way that I work and the way that I think about social justice, art, visual culture, music, youth culture, and how that plays a role in what I do. I got introduced to galleries through museums and galleries in the early 2000s. And that was through, there were so many diversity programs happening at the time. And that was how I was introduced. I won't go into it now, perhaps we can speak later. So I'd say the core principles / values that those have forged, I think throughout my work, both more specifically with young people, nationally with young people's programs, and then my role now is looking at head of program practices around equity, social and cultural justice, and this idea of collaborative interdisciplinary practices. Can we do next slide, please? Yeah, so what I'm going to do now is just quickly go through the strategy that we hold, because it will kind of make sense in terms of what we were thinking at the time in terms of learning and research at Tate, and then where we came to in 2020 and perhaps where we are now. So we believe in a democratic and inclusive approach to learning with art, new approaches to research that seek to innovate in order to challenge and change how we look at art practice, the production of art and ideas, and the broader context of a rapidly changing world. Some of the values, some will emerge as well, as I mentioned before, is this idea that we change how we work so that staff can thrive, and we believe in our vision and strategy as we deliver our vision and strategy. Really champion creative learning, both nationally and internationally, reframe our program to ensure there's regular offer and priorities for audiences across a wide range of forms, create a vibrant research culture across Tate that generates quality research and art ideas, practice shared with a wide and diverse public. Can't quite see the last bit, but this is around building a shared practice to support equity and representation across our organization for a broad and diverse public. Next slide, please. So yeah, so with the uncertainty of 2020, we really needed to look and revisit our aims and plans and think about how we could support our staff through these new changing times. So the first thing that we asked ourselves was, well, what has changed? What will learning and research look like in the next 2 years? And where do we want to focus our energies? How do we manage ourselves? And how do we respond ahead? The next slide, please. So what has changed? I mean, many of the things we're all very much aware of. The move to remote working, a reduction in our connectivity with others in terms of physical space, this refocus on anti-racism, race equality, decolonial practices, both within our team across Tate and society, health, well-being, care, the negative profile of museums and galleries more broadly, especially those with specific histories, social inequity, the pandemic, reduction in budget, and a refocus of audience priorities. And I think especially with us kind of moving online was quite an important shift. Next slide, please. So as we know, going forward now, it's still pretty much the same reduction in budget, funded programs, continuing change context, audience priorities are shifting towards hyper-local, thinking about communities, networks that are underrepresented at Tate, planning new processes and approach to systems, just to really rethink and change how we think of communities, how we think of the galleries, and forming new decision-making processes that really enable us to work much more closely across departments. Next slide, please. So then going forward, we've been thinking our priorities now are really about building processes so we're able to share practice that enables inequity or inequality, racism, discrimination, through all aspects of our work to be actively shared and to be understood. I think there's lots of internal work to be done. To also really think about practices of care, back to that thing about how we enable our staff to thrive, create a vibrant research culture. I think internationally, across the institutions and the organization, build new cross-departmental work that decentralizes us and enables us to amplify community's voice, build flexible working models so that we can be much more responsive. Next slide, please. And of course, there are huge barriers to that. And I think some of these are really around the sort of bureaucratic processes of large organizations, internal staff trust, such as staff versus consultation, organizational memory, and this understanding of a new digital space. Some of the external barriers, of course, have been that many organizations have resource constraints as well, digital fatigue in terms of the programs that we're putting out online, and the lack of physical meeting spaces. I think also defining what our civic and social usefulness has been a massive consideration that we're all asking our questions about. How can we be useful now? Next slide, please. So this idea of how we make absence visible, so those who are there and not there, whose voices are important at the moment. Is Tate's voice actually that important? How do we re-establish connections with our communities of interest and need? And this idea of working across digital and online, in gallery, and this idea of real life URL online. Thinking also about how we share our skills, defining resources, establishing processes that enables us to be productive in the methods that we use going forward. Next slide, please. So yeah, this idea of stop, pause, and these are still questions that we're asking ourselves. Are we set up to be adaptable? Such a large organization. Answers probably very much no. Are we set up for anti-racism work? Who are we serving now? Is this something we need to question and shift as an organization? How important is our organizational voices now? And how do we enable those spaces to be much more polyphonic? We need to do the internal work for this resetting, for the practices, processes and systems. And the internal work is the only way that we can achieve that internal change. I think that's the last slide. Just let's make that.
Mark, thank you so much. And to all three of you, thank you. There's a lot running in my mind right now from these three, the sharing that each of you has done. I think that first, before I say anything, I want to invite everyone to enter thoughts or questions into the chat. And we've got about 15 minutes to all together. We invite everyone to stay after for some smaller conversation, but we understand that this is scheduled from 1 to 2 and people may need to leave. So please do enter any questions that you'd like to put to our guests. Kimathi, you got me thinking about curriculum as a site of tremendously complex range of work possibilities and of change. I mean, following the path of your thinking through these various projects, many of which were really kind of centered around curriculum. And Raimi, you got me very focused on both spaces and the power of spaces to become catalyst for thought and for learning. And Mark, you really drew my thinking toward the role of the institution itself and the possibility that the institution can in a sense, learn and change in a time like this or any time. Mark, you framed your comments with a question, which is, what if we just paused? And I wonder if I could ask each of you to share a question that for you in your work and the development of your practice and your thought has been, in a sense, over time, an animating question, a question that sticks with you and pushes you forward. Raimi, please jump in.
You know, The question, I suppose, that propels me. So if I think of this moment, a lot has been happening globally. The trial of the police officer that killed Floyd is going on at the moment. Britain has just, our government has just released a report that says that Britain should be an exemplar when it comes to race, because it's absolutely wonderful in Britain and everything is going so well. You know, so I guess the question that propels me at the moment is, you know, I'm trying to think how to pose the question. At what point will power be able to recognize the individual outside of itself as a racialized body?
Thank you, Raimi. Kimathi, Mark.
Yeah, I suppose if I jump in, Mark, is that okay? While you still recover from that, those deep thoughts on Tate. I suppose my if I had to try and the question that animates me is like, it's gonna sound so, I don't know, it's gonna sound a little bit, what's the word, naive really. How can I make a difference, leave the world in a better state than I found it? I know that's a bit obviously ambition, but you know, I mean, I suppose, especially in the last few years, I mean, and I know it's true of my colleagues as well. I've become a father, and you know, thinking about how my daughters are going to be experiencing education, art and culture, and sort of wider, you know, experiences in society. And I really am trying to think, how can I make interventions which can somehow, you know, help to shift the overall, you know, discourse. So I suppose that's the thing that animates me, is like, what can I do that, you know, it's gonna be something which, you know, makes a difference. Yeah. Bit of a big one.
Yes, but crucial.
Yeah.
Mark?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, you know, because I've got so many questions that I ask. I think one of the ones, and I don't know if it's directly a question, and again might be slightly naive, but it's about how do you make empathy more tangible and, I don't know, more visible or more visceral. I'm not sure what because I think for me as well, I think like Raimi and Kimathi, you know, we've all been working for quite a long time. And I think as Black men in the UK, you know, you keep working, and then the generations come and you see the repetition and the loss of memory, and there's a kind of real cycle of as we're going through now, reports, they disappear, more reports appear, and you know, there's this cycle of a loss of memory. And I think sometimes the question to myself is like, you know, what do I do to enable organizational, social, and cultural memory to exist or continue? And I think it's part of that kind of the sort of remembrance of empathy, I suppose. And that's what I've been thinking a lot about over the last year or so, more so than ever. And I've been asking myself, you know, mainly just why, you know, that just kind of holds that space for me, to be honest.
Thinking about, I mean, Mark, you, how long have you been at Tate? You told us, and it's since
now.
2006, was it?
Yeah, 2006. So yeah, that's 15 years, I think, this year.
Um, Kimathi and Raimi, I'm going to put a question to Mark, but it's a question for you as well in your own contexts. Given the kinds of concerns which are, voiced in very different ways, but maybe more connected than they might seem on the surface. I'm thinking about how any of you or any of us build our relationships with institutions. In our experiences, perhaps particularly colleges and museums, but the rest of us could think about any other institutions that we have connected with in order to do work at this intersection of learning, art, activism, social justice, politics, questions of power. And I'm curious, Mark, over that long time and in the context of this question, what if we just paused? Because so many of the questions that you were raising when you were speaking have to do with the possibility and capacity of an institution to play a powerful and important and progressive role in the society.
Hmm.
So how do you negotiate that for yourself? I mean, how do you see you've stayed at Tate, so something's working there for you, but there are clearly many challenges, and I'm curious about how you see that and how you negotiate that.
Yeah, a good question. I think how I negotiate that is I believe that an organization such as Tate, which has huge brand, lots of visibility, culturally iconic in many ways, both in problematic ways as well as the benefits of artistic ways in a sense. But what I negotiate is always just thinking that, in a way, if I am going to be in galleries and museums and trying to think about how I can create access or positive disruption, that is the best place that I can be to do that. I think I always believe that the platform has so much visibility that if several, young or emerging artists or artists generally, whether they're of color or from a different class or facing socioeconomic challenges, whatever it is, whatever the intersectional discriminations that they're experiencing, I think just to kind of be able to hold or provide a space for a collision to happen in some form is always, that's the way I negotiate that space. I just always think like, we need to be there and we need to represent and we need to be in those spaces to be able to make that shift happen. And that shift is extremely slow. And all the time, all the years I've been there, things have changed massively, but just not enough, and it keeps going, and that's how I negotiate that space for me in terms of work. I think in terms of the last year or so, it's been tough because of the position one holds, and also the position that Tate holds in its history. Well, not even Tate, just museums, galleries, cultural organizations, the land of the UK, that whole space holds it. And I think Tate has been good to me, if I'm honest. I've progressed, I've had opportunities to be experimental, to do different things, to diversify the audience, to work with young people, to work with really interesting and important artists through my programs. So in a way, I haven't had problems apart from when it gets to that, when you think about the whole and you think, God, this really hasn't changed that much. And then you think, yeah, some things, you know, it's just that, yeah, don't know.
Thank you for that thoughtfulness and candor, Mark. Kimathi and Raimi, I wonder what your thoughts are here, and we'll take your comments to round out our time together because we're right up against 2 o'clock.
Do you want to go, Kimathi, or shall I?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of the things I would say really, and it kind of speaks a little bit to what Mark said about legacy, is, I mean, my engagement with, because I think when I first started my journey of life as an adult, I was very, very disheartened by the possibility of any kind of, you know, positive movement through institutions. But actually, I mean, Mark and Raimi both are kind of quite important role models for me, because they've been in the game longer than I have. And so seeing them and other peers and colleagues who've also got that kind of seniority, being able to make meaningful change has been really, really important. So I suppose for me, part of it has been trying to think of myself as being part of, even if it doesn't always feel like that, but think of myself as being part of something wider, a wider movement, a wider sort of experience, a network, if you like, that is a progressive network. And also to think of that as a responsibility, to not only have people like Mark and Raimi being sort of influential in helping me to progress, but also thinking about how I can, you know, offer the same kind of, you know, platform, if you like, for people who are also seeking to make progress. So that's the kind of thing for me, is that thinking of networks, which is very, very, it's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do, but trying to, because I think especially coming from just around this off, especially come from the practice of specifically working in the field of like painting, you know, art has got a reputation for being a very individualistic, you know, industry where it's all about the name, the one, the person, the genius. So, you know, we know obviously many artists have challenged this through various methods of collective working, but yeah, thinking about the collective and the many rather than the one is always a struggle, I think, in the art world.
Great.
Not so much in education, but certainly, you know, the way the two of them meet.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
yeah,
you know, I'd like to discuss institutions as proxies for collective power, and you know, and in their role as proxies, they kind of, they help determine the way we see ourselves, and in their role of proxies, when they function as gatekeepers, they inadvertently establish the way that power sees its population. And so, you know, as Mark and Kimathi have said, you know, to get into the institution is really important, because if it is functioning as a real proxy, then to get in means that one can start tampering with the way that power functions. Now, it isn't easy. You know, a young artist gets their first show at Tate and they know that they're going somewhere. And it is not even necessarily, hopefully the work is good, or they get to the Guggenheim or MoMA. But the fact is, what it says to the world is the power is allowing you entry. And which is why, for me, issues around race and power become really significant when one starts engaging with institutions, especially when power at large, if you take a moment like this, I mean, it's 2021, we would think that we'd moved much further, but we still have to negotiate with those larger power structures. And these institutions will carry out that role for us. You know, power, when it really works, is invisible, as we know. You know, it's both in theorized and in existence. So these institutions do take on particular roles. And it is really useful for those who can affect the way that institutions function to make them do different things, to make them healthy, to make them welcoming, to, again, as proxies, show that power is capable of recognizing bodies other than itself.
I thank all three of you, both for your words and for the work that you've been sharing with us today and the work that you've been doing. This is tremendously provocative in the best sense, thought-provoking. I'm very grateful. I'm sure I speak for the rest. I don't know, Garrett, whether everyone can unmute, but it would be nice to make some sound and noise for our guests who have been so generous. So is that up to us, or is that up to you, Garrett, to unmute?
We are all able to unmute, so please.
And I invite everyone to unmute and acknowledge our guests.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic work.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Garrett and Lucia Lee and Caitlin and Ashley, I want to say again, a tremendous word of gratitude to you all for this entire series, but especially today for this curating this particular gathering. My understanding is that we can stay in this space. I want to be very careful with our guests. I know that you may need to move on, and that's totally understood, but and others may need to, but everyone here is welcome to hang for a few minutes, and we can continue this conversation. But for this moment, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We know
Yeah,
what
I also want to make sure that you have a chance to name the next upcoming events.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Steve. I would have forgot. On April 23rd, so 3 Fridays from now, or 2, however we want to slice it, we'll be having Chip McNeil he's the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the San Francisco Opera, and Carlos Simon, who is an American composer, to speak with us and continue this conversation. I will definitely keep the room open now. I think one of the most challenging parts of Zoom is hearing something rich and profound and having to sit alone in your room and not have anyone to speak those thoughts with. So feel free to open up, share something that you're going to take away with you today, or questions that have been sparked by this beautiful conversation. And again, thank you to our guests. This is certainly personally one of the most meaningful things that has happened this year while in our 1-year program. And I just couldn't be more thankful. So feel free to unmute yourself, put a question in the chat, whatever anyone would like.
Caitlin, I see you've got a hand up, so maybe you'd like to jump in.
I do have a question if our guests are still here with us, but if you have to run, I understand too. But
It is bath time.
it's bath time. Okay, well,
But
that's
I
negotiable.
can hold off for a little while.
Well, I just wanted to ask, I'm really, really struck, Raimi, by the image that you showed of the piece you did with the games set up in the gallery space, and thinking about what Mark brought up about institutional amnesia, and the way I'm kind of making a connection between the idea of a game, which is like a simulated engagement, often having to do with war or, combat of some form. And then this idea of institutions as proxies, and the way that often the people within them are like manipulated like pieces. and then a game kind of ends and maybe is forgotten, but for some people it's real. So I'm kind of, that was a tangle of thoughts, but I'm just kind of wondering with that particular piece, like, you also showed an image of kids playing the game. Like, what were you kind of hoping for them to get out of that, or what did they take from that experience? And yeah, one last piece of that thought, I was able to see a installation years ago in Iceland by Roni Horn, called The Library of Water, where she had taken water from glaciers around Iceland that were disappearing and kind of encapsulated them. And then next to them were chess boards set up. So you could kind of sit and play chess within this space, kind of memorializing, you know, the vanishing Earth. And I felt like those two pieces, your piece and her piece, I don't know, I'm just curious to hear more about like the game and what does that mean or do?
Games are complex,
Yeah.
you know, especially when they've been very well established. They allow us kind of ways of articulating feelings with a vocabulary that we hopefully expect that most people will easily understand. Now, I'm going to go to the children and I'll come back to the games. So when I would like to give two anecdotes on that show. One where two boys in particular, each day after school would come to the show. And I was there for the duration. I would wake up in the morning, go to the gallery and be there and do my thing, play fella all day. And then at nighttime would leave. And one day a woman came in and said, oh, asked me and said, oh, this fella, oh yeah, read about the show, came along. I mean, you know, people are beginning to listen to fella. And I remember my response was people. She said, yeah, people. And I said, you know, there are 250 million people in Nigeria alone who all know about fella. So what you mean by people is white people, not people. And so that's one anecdote. The other anecdote is that by the end of the show, these two boys who came in had become ardent fans of Fela's music. And I gave each of them a CD to keep. Just they would come in and just play and listen to the music and dance. And so there was a transition for both of them, both for the children and for the adult. Now, you know, to sit within a space and to absorb these ideas, to ask questions, it's really important to me. You know, the kind of, you know, fella, it is really important to fella about kind of the role of Africa in the world, the role of Black people in the world. And these things come through. So, you know, if you are an individual sitting somewhere, it does feel like a game. It does feel as if some people can manipulate your existence very easily and get away with it. And sometimes the game befuddles you just when you think you know how to control it, especially a game like golf, for instance. And I think I'll stop there.
Are there other questions or just thoughts? I mean, it's a conversation at this point, and in fact, Kimathi and Mark, you please feel welcome to ask us questions or ask each other questions or share thoughts at all.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yes.
About the program that you're involved with. I was sharing with you some ideas about the way that we've sort of tried to embed thoughts on identity in our curriculum. And I understand that obviously with an institution like Harvard, where, for example, you've got a long-standing sort of, you know, I think it's a African American Studies department, or
African and African American studies. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Whereas sort of in that's something which doesn't really exist in UK universities, apart from one. I think one, Birmingham, has got it, but all the other 60 or 70 universities don't. So I was just wondering whether you know how you sort of deal with those kind of questions in terms of curriculum within your. It may be that you think that the way that we or I've done it is a bit clunky, but I just wanted, yeah, if anyone had any thoughts about it and how it works in your institution.
Yeah, I want to actually turn to, I know who's currently in the program and who's been in the program. If anyone would want to jump in and share thoughts first, I can also share some thoughts. But Kimathi, I put the question to the group.
Mm. Mm.
So, thank you for coming.
Oh, Jamie, go ahead.
Okay, Garrett, are you?
Go, baby.
Okay, cool. Thank you for.
And Jamie and everyone, just introduce yourselves as you begin. So Jamie.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm on my home internet, Steve, today, so that has the delay and not my hotspot. So I apologize for the delay. I'm Jamie Moss. I'm a current student in the AIE program. And so to answer your question, I think Steve and the teaching team does a great job of bringing us diverse readings from across the spectrum in terms of intersections, right? So you're talking about race, you're talking about gender, you're talking about ethnicity, you're talking about other identities, LGBTQ, I plus, I may be missing one there, but I think that they really try to make sure that that's done. What I also think they do is that they encourage us to bring our full self and full experience that we bring into our discussion, right? And so, for instance, let me give you an example. A couple of weeks ago, the first half of the semester, Steve gave us a reading about defunding the police. It was a wonderful reading, and I think it was by Kaba, if I'm not mistaken. And there were some things in there related to everything that can be made can be unmade, which I absolutely love. There were also some things in there about policing in general in Black people. And for me as a Black person, that was an intersection because I come from a family of law enforcement people, right? So I was telling the class that my mother is military police, she's Black. My stepdad, lead narcotics investigator, he's Black. My uncle, county investigator, he's Black. My brother trained the police force in Afghanistan, he's Black. My other brother is a captain in Atlanta, Georgia with the police, he's Black, right? So that kind of intersection. And Steve and the teaching team and the students in the class honored my voice in that dialogue and that intersection. And I think, I know that is intentionally designed and sort of interwoven in not only his pedagogical style, but in the curriculum that's set forth.
Thank you, Jamie.
Kimathi, Raimi, were you?
No, I mean, you know, I kind of, I'm interested in that as an example, Jamie, and my interest lies in, is it an intersection that there are Black police officers? Unless one imagines that to be Black and to be a police officer are, you know, that they're incompatible. Now, the reason why I ask this, and you know, it's because there's something structured within that argument for me, that if they're not incompatible, then there is nothing for there to be an intersection of. But there's kind of an admission within that. And I think that there's something deeply complex in that relationship, in saying, especially again, and we speak of institutions and how institutions function, for me at least, as proxies. And all of these positions you list are part of institutions. So my question is, where is the intersection and why?
Maybe that's such a great question. So it's interesting because while you were talking earlier, I actually direct messaged a person in the class to sort of stamp something that you were saying. So you talked about Mark in the space of Tate in like that position, and sort of, and I'm paraphrasing here, but working in the system, right? That kind of thing, and negotiating kind of power. I think that for folks in my context, right, there is a kind of, I don't want to say war, but a kind of different factions, right? So there are some people who believe that that there are no intersections in terms of that thing. You're working in the system for the betterment, and I'm going to use Black people as an example, right? Because that's my context, being Black American. So you're working in a system for Black Americans, right? But then there are other people who feel as though if you're working in that system, you are betraying Black America, right? Like just the nature of you doing that thing in an oppressive system is a betrayal of that, of being Black, in a system that continuously marginalized us. And I also think that there are great points on like both of those ends, right? I do think that as Black people in this country, and myself included, we sometimes sustain systems of oppression, whether we know it or not, right? Like we actually adhere to those things, and we are sustaining what we're actually fighting against, which is like a weird thing. And I've been like unpacking it for myself in my current iteration, right? So I'm actually still doing the work, and my family, we are still doing the work, and my friends are still doing that kind of work. I'm not sure that answers your particular question, but that's sort of where I am now in my current iteration.
Right, if I can just say one last thing, and I'll try to keep this really short, is that, often the questions that are asked and the kind of the requirements imposed on those without power are not asked of the powerful. That's what I just like to say.
Mark, were you leaning in?
Yeah, I just wondered, I suppose with sort of what I was speaking about, whether institutions or cultural institutions are asking similar questions. I mean, I would well imagine so, but I just wondered whether there are any differences in those questions, because I'm not sure about what the impact of COVID race relations are, apart from obviously what you see on the media, but what is the lived experience of that in the US, So basically, I don't know how much the government is supporting cultural organizations, for example, and is there a wholesale rethink of, and of course, US history, is much shorter than the UK in terms of, its establishment of its culture. So I just wondered whether there is a bit of a rethink of, these large scale, icons of power institutions as well.
And again, please jump in.
It feels like there's many things happening at once. There's naming that there's a lot of buzzwords of we are now an anti-racist institution that is not doing the work at all, but makes people feel like they're doing the work. Harvard has done that. The institutions that we work at have done that. And at the same time, there are small factions in those that are going in and trying to disrupt from the root and go back to the root. And so there's a lot of tension that is happening. We do have, and Caitlin can speak to this more, she was in our ethnic studies course that's happening at Hugsy, which has very different conversations at Harvard than what's happening at the business school. That has very different conversations than what are happening at the Kennedy School, which is our government school. And that gap causes so much tension within the university itself, which just is mirroring the larger system. And so how do we move through? So those things are happening, and it's, I was just speaking with a friend who works at the Boston Public Schools, which is the history of racism that runs within that system is so deep, and she was sharing with me, and they've labeled themselves an anti-racist public school system. And she basically is saying, what the fuck, that's not true. We're still offering standardized tests. We're still offering, or, you know, have behavioral issues that are, we're naming things that are not true and not taking into the larger context. So it's confusing to figure out which direction to move. It's who's pushing the wheel forward, who's going back to the root. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's certainly what it feels like at Harvard.
It reminds me of last year when we had the sort of the explosion of Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. I mean, in the UK, and a lot of institutions, you know, wanted to, you know, mark or put forward a sort of statements of solidarity, one way or another, including my university, who put forward put out a statement saying that, you know, they were an anti-racist institution, and there was an immediate outcry by students who set up an Instagram page, I think called UAL Truth, in which they detailed like dozens or hundreds of sort of instances of racial abuse and et cetera, from and instant, you know, events and all kinds of problems. So much so that the university then had to issue another statement saying, well, actually, yeah, maybe we overstated our anti-racism, and you know, perhaps we're not as anti-racist as we thought we were. So yeah, so I think I suppose what that speaks to is that we are hopefully in a moment of and it's happened again with this report which I think one of us mentioned about I think it was Raimi mentioned about a government report in the UK, you know, where they've come out with this foolish report claiming that there's no racism, or that there's no institutional racism in Britain. And there's been such a massive kind of outcry against it that, you know, you can see they're starting to backpedal already. Whether they will or not is another question. But it's really interesting the way that you know, institutions try to position themselves in certain ways, hoping to catch the sail, the wind of the moment. But then they kind of, you know, to mix my metaphors, then they suddenly realize they aren't wearing any clothes. So yeah.
I think there's also like a really significant structural reality in American higher ed, which is that we have this system of tenure. So there are, you know, the people in power at these schools are essentially given power for the rest of their life. and those people, you know, tend to be white, cis male professors from elite backgrounds. And I think there's a big mismatch between what a lot of students come to these institutions looking for, the kind of learning they want, and then who they have access to. And I think that results in, you know, teachers of color and from other like marginalized identities then having all of their classes packed and wait lists. And so, I mean, I see that as like, it's like the opposite of institutional amnesia. It's like there's a stuckness within schools in America. I work at the oldest art school in America, which is in Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. And our school had a huge convulsion around issues of race. And, but, you know, we have, like the institution is designed to keep certain people in power, and there really aren't a lot of ways for that to change as it is now. So I don't know, that's not with specific reference to our program and the pedagogy within it, but I think these structures matter and a lot of students aren't really aware of them until maybe they start teaching, or yeah. I don't know if that's similar in the UK or.
Yeah, I think Raimi's point about the game, it becomes so much more, I don't know, more visible, especially here. I think like Kimathi was saying, you know, there are lots of statements, you know, Tate delayed its statement, thought, oh, shall we, shan't we? You know how the power organizations work. They know they should, but they're also very aware of the brand and the message and where they'll get critique or whatever. But I think it really feels now, for me, like it is about the game and, you know, the proxies and the power that Raimi talks about. And I think my fear is the sort of, and I can feel it, especially in big organizations, there's still the holding on to power. You know, I think however many statements we make, there is a kind of, I feel that there's a hope that things will go back to normal. And I think that's the bit that I think folks like us need to really be aware of. And, you know, and I know we are anyway, but I just think, like, you know, physically, process wise, systematically, you know, how we think about, you know, the next 5 years is so important in terms of that game. And I'm not saying it like, hey, let's play a game, but I think, you know, it is, you know, and it's like, what are the strategies and systems that we can put in place in terms of that collective that Kimathi was talking about. I think that is so important. I think in the UK, that's actually one of the most important things that's happened to especially Black artists and young Black artists, is actually they're building and recording collectives and find themselves, if you live in Manchester or you live in London or you live in Somerset, you know, they are identifying with each other and they're connecting. And I know that because I've got young daughters, you know, that actually it's just so important that actually we record ourselves as well, you know. And I think, like, you know, 80s, 90s, we didn't do enough of that documentation and sharing, and we couldn't, obviously, because technology was very different. But yeah, I just think just that kind of waiting to go back to normal, you know, because they say the economy in the UK is going to kick off in or get stabilized by 24, 25, you know. So there is also this holding of change, and not to, you know, we're doing things at Tate, but, you know, when you look at the top and you think, well, actually, what is actually changing, you know, really what is changing. And I think it is about, it is changing, you know, don't get me wrong, but I just think the moment like now and the last year, I really thought there would have just been this flip, you know. And even the time that we spent in isolation, I thought many people would have shifted. And that's why I was saying that thing about empathy, you know. But actually, when I go back to work, or actually even just out in society, you still feel that, like, you know, let's wait and go back to what was, you know. And I hope I'm wrong, and I hope the next 6 months shows something different. But yeah, that's my 2 pennies.
Let me, it would just past 2:30. Amanda has raised her hand. I'm torn because I want to be careful about people's time. Amanda, do you want to just make a quick comment?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. So hi, I'm Amanda Tobin. I'm an alum of the program, class of 2013. And I work at MassMoCA, the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art right now. And we are in the midst of a unionization campaign because of some of the things that came up around funding and job and security and inequities at the institution. And so we are part of this huge wave of American institutions they're unionizing right now. And so I think that's going to change the game for anti-racist work, labor work within the museum and arts sector. And so I was just sort of wondering what those conversations are like in the UK. And I know we might not have time for that, but just wanted to throw that out there too. Thank you.
Yeah. First of all, good luck with the campaign. But is there a quick response about that dynamic in UK?
I think
Well,
the
I
fact
mean,
that we're
I would just like to say, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say quickly, and hello, Amanda, as well. Yeah. We because of voluntary redundancy that we're going through at the moment, you know, literally around 30% of staff are going to leave Tate, well, have left Tate on 31st of March. So massive reductions in staff. But I think you're right that the connection with the unions has definitely grown, and the importance of that. And I think that's getting stronger and stronger, even before the very first Tate enterprises, you know, all the furore that went up about Tate cutting jobs, etc. And there's the enterprise and then there's a gallery, but I think now the gallery, you know, it's actually union representation is getting much stronger. So I think you make a really good point, actually, just about how that could be the real shift, you know.
I mean, in terms of the, hi Amanda, and thank you, Mark. In terms of with us, I mean, literally, I remember we had a strike in the university sector last year in the UK on a series of questions similar to what you've just mentioned, partly to do with pay, overwork, but also, you know, questions of inequality, of race and gender specifically. And the strike was unsuccessful in the sense that, you know, we weren't able to have a victory, but it was such an interesting moment because I can remember being on the picket line at Camberwell, where I work, and speaking to one of my colleagues, and he came up to me, kind of tried to shake my hand. This is in March. I was like, no, man, I ain't shaking anyone's hand now, because this is just before we went into lockdown. So literally, and I felt so terrible for our students that they had to suffer this strike. And then as soon as the strike finished, the whole college shut down, and they lost their access to their studios, and we had to go into online learning. So I think, I suppose perhaps the point I'm making is that in the UK, I suppose unionization is probably not as poor as it is in the United States. It's a different setup. But at the same time, you know, whether or not it provides an answer is another question. I think it's only one part of a overall sort of, can only be one part of overall social movements. I think there's a lot of ways in which unions can actually be quite reactionary in holding back. You know, we've talked about, you know, personnel. There's a way in which sort of unionization has often been used as a way to entrench privilege, white privilege, male privilege, heterosexual privilege, by sort of trying to, you know, create barriers to entry into various professions. So, you know, it's I think the unions in themselves they're important, but they're not necessarily a panacea, and they're just as much venues of fields of struggle as are the sort of workplaces themselves, if that makes sense.
Hey, you know,
Raimi, why don't we give you the last word?
Yeah, I mean, there are kind of two quick things I'd like to say. There's the type of optimism that I would like to state. You know, that for every young, and I'm going to deliberately say, for every young Black artist that goes to a major institution and say, I want to be in here, represents a type of optimism that they really shouldn't have. Not that it is impossible, because clearly these exhibitions happen, but at such a point we think, you know, yeah, just go for it. And this is really important. But, you know, and I'm going to segue into unions, and I'm going to kind of rely on Du Bois to help me out here. Because Du Bois, all those years ago, wrote about unions and what it meant to be Black in relationship to the unions, and how, you know, the white proletariat were effectively used against Black people. If you think of the Great Migration, in part, how Black people were used, literally used as instruments to disrupt unions in the North. And there's a paradox within that, because the Northern workers who, you know, on one hand saw Black people as union breakers, wouldn't have given them jobs in the first place. So, you know, so what do we do? So yes, I think that there should be optimism around unions, and kind of in a way to rehearse Kimathi is saying, but they are deeply problematic. And I would just like to end kind of with the same strike that Kimathi was mentioning. I too was on the picket line at a different university, the same strike. And as we're marching around, one of the leaders, self-appointed or otherwise, who was leading a chant, suddenly decided to say, Black and white unite, some kind of well-known chant. And I had to go up to him and ask, well, why are you saying this? What has this got to do with this moment? And then I realized he was just saying it by rote. It was what was said, not necessarily what was felt. And I will end there.
Once again, Raimi and Kimathi and Mark, we can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks very much. Take care, everybody.
Really big to